Hello everyone, this is Guy. I know it has been quite a while since my last video, but let's just say that life has gotten in the way. I also spent some time reading a couple dozen books, and it is not that life stopped getting in the way, quite the opposite. If you recall, I live in Israel, and as you know, since October 7th, there has been quite the flare-up between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, which involved a massive loss of life on both sides. Since then, about 1,400 Israeli civilians and soldiers and tourists were killed by Hamas terrorists on October 7th. And since then, Israel has been bombarding Gaza. And it seems that in the last few hours, it has started its ground offensive into Gaza, with the stated goals of bringing down Hamas and liberating the kidnapped Israelis and non-Israelis that Hamas kidnapped. And by the way, I do mean kidnapped and not prisoners of war, because prisoners of war is only a term that applies if you adhere to certain international laws, such as giving access to Red Cross personnel to the prisoners and letting out signs of life, which Hamas has not done and has not done in the past either. This is actually a very complicated topic that I plan to cover in multiple chunks before the recent flare-up, and which also requires certain videos that I did not yet make as background material. As such, this video will not go as deep as I might have hoped, and it will be a bit longer than usual because it will combine and compress quite a few issues. My goal with this video, as always, is not to convince you of my opinion, and not everything I will say will be my opinion. My intention, as always, is to try and present things multifaceted, to present the complexities involved in the situation. And I believe that if you think that the situation is clear-cut, you are not only wrong, but you are not humane. Because whichever side you support, you deny the humanity and the basic needs of the other side. There is a saying that goes, when the cannons are heard, the muses are silent. I don't think that's true at all, because the arts often join the national efforts whenever there is a war. What I do think is true is that when the explosions light up the air, the contrast is turned up to max, which eliminates all shades of gray, leaves us with just black and white. I did have to consider whether to make this video because I'm pretty sure that both sides, so to speak, and here I mean pro-Israel and anti-Israel, and I do mean it that way rather than pro-Israel and pro-Palestine, both sides will likely take issue with me. So the comments on this video will be moderated. You don't have to agree with me. You just have to be civil. Israel, a couple of days ago, Antonio Guterres, the chairman of the UN, said that while decrying the attack by Hamas, the attack did not exist in a vacuum. So I'm going to say something similar but different, because if I say, despite the fact that it doesn't justify or excuse it, but the but does say that to some degree it does justify or excuse it. So it doesn't. I'm going to say X happened and there was an attack by Hamas on innocent Israelis and an attack by other Gazans that were not necessarily Hamas operatives, and the situation does not exist in a vacuum. No situation exists in a vacuum. Part of the issue currently is that after there is such an attack on a country, naturally it leads the group forming a barrier around it, closing in together, becoming more cohesive. So voices of dissent or voices that suggest identification or sympathy with the other side are seen as internal opposition, and that certainly happens in Israel. Israel decried Antonio Guterres' words, and in fact, by the way, on October 7th, some of Benjamin Netanyahu's supporters said that all the civilians from the kibbutzim who are generally liberals and left-supporting deserved what they got, or even that the left-supporting generals have invited this attack in order to topple Bibi's government, which gives you an idea of some of the internal strife and fascist voices that are heard within Israel at this time. But again, it also makes sense. Every time there is an attack on a group of people, they tend to close in, to detach themselves from those around them. I can tell you that the second Intifada in 2001 led to most Israelis believing that there is no hope for the peace process, or rather that there is no partner, as the saying by Ehud Barak, who was the prime minister of Israel at the time, said. And what happened on October 7th around Gaza, and what is happening in Gaza to date, and will continue happening in Gaza, which is the Israeli offensive, are both projected to push off any hope for peace for the foreseeable future and perhaps even beyond. And that, by the way, is exactly the goal of Hamas, and the way in which Hamas and Bibi are mirrors of one another, because neither side wants peace. Both sides want the entire land to themselves. And peace requires concessions. Neither side wants a dual citizenship country where Israeli Jews and Palestinians are equal. And by the by, most Israeli leftists and most Palestinians who wish for peace do not wish for that situation either. There are some who do, but they are the extreme minority. Most people who desire peace want there to be an independent Palestine and an independent Israel living side by side. And Hamas and the Israeli right, both sides do not wish to make concessions and wish to have the entire land from the river to the sea. And for that to happen, they need there to be war. They need there to be an enemy. That is, by the way, another fascist trait where you must have an enemy on the outside. And if there isn't one, you find one on the inside, which is what happened in Europe during the 1940s, and is happening the last 2 decades in various areas of the world. Now, before we go further, we do need to go over the rules of engagement. These are the rules that I go over just to set up a baseline for discussion. You can pause the video and read these rules in depth. There's also a video that will be linked in the description that goes over the logic behind each of them. The first is watch the segment to the end. The second, comparisons don't mean I find things equal. To say that two things are different, you have to make a comparison between them. But it doesn't mean that I find them morally equal. 3, not all arguments are intended to be equally good. I will be making arguments and their counter arguments, and I will also be making some arguments because others make them and I think they need to be addressed. 4, I'm not trying to convince you. Again, I'm not trying to convince you to agree with me. I'm trying to make you see things from more angles, to consider things from different perspectives. 5, assume what I say unsourced is preceded by I think or in my opinion. And 6, most questions aren't rhetorical. When I will ask you, what do you do in XYZ situation, that's not rhetorical. I want you to actually think about it and perhaps post an answer if you have one in the comment. Now, with that out of the way, let's go back to what Antonio Guterres had to say. I agree with the idea in general. It's important to understand the other side. The understanding doesn't mean that we agree with it. We can understand anything that has an internal logic. So anything that isn't an actual delusion can be understood. If you look at the Jewish-Israeli education system, we are all taught about the Nazi regime and the Holocaust. In fact, we learn so much about their logic and the minutiae of their laws and logic for racial relations that I doubt anyone outside Israel who is not a Holocaust scholar, but knows nearly as much as your average graduate of the Israeli education system. So clearly, even Nazis can be understood, and surely we can understand Hamas. But I think that the reason that any understanding of Hamas is seen as an attack on Israel is because that humanizes Hamas, while its actions have been barbarous and inhumane, and in order to wage war on other people, you need to remove the sense of humanity they possess to some degree, so you'd be able to kill them. That's also what Hamas has clearly done to Israel and Israelis, which has allowed its terrorists to perform the acts that they had on October 7th. And not just that, while it is agreed that the Nazi regime was monstrous, so we can understand it without there being any debate over who was in the right and who was in the wrong back during World War II. That is not the case today, where there are many people who actually support Hamas, not just Palestine, but Hamas itself, and actually support the attack on Israeli civilians. Let's talk about some of that. The first thing is, this is all about narratives. Some people will tell you that it is all about facts, but people are not swayed by facts nearly as much as they would like to believe. And this conflict actually proves that in the court of public opinion and on social media. And you can clearly see that people reject or accept what they do based on their biases. And in case it's not clear, everyone has biases. I have biases as well. I am a secular liberal Jew who lives in Israel. I think I am less biased than most Israelis you would encounter on Israel and Israeli-Arab relationship. For example, usually when I discuss these matters with Israelis, I tend to present the more liberal view, the view that argues that even if peace is not reachable soon, we should still strive for it, for there to be any chance of it happening at any time. And when I discuss things with people abroad, I tend to take the side that defends Israel. And it is not a case of being a devil's advocate, because a devil's advocate will argue the opposite for the sake of the argumentation. It is more the case that I hold views that aren't that clearly cut pro-Israel or against Israel, so to speak. And I always try to make people see the other side. And there's also another aspect that has been researched in the past, which is if you argue with people, you push them further to the other side. So usually when you argue with people, you are not going to convince them. Quite the opposite. You are going to make them get entrenched further from your position. So this is another thing that's important to keep in mind. If everyone attacks Israel online or abroad, then Israelis will feel attacked by that as well, which will cause a further shift to the right. And if the argument online is that if you are pro-Israel, you are against Palestinians, And if you are, and vice versa, then at some point people will accept that, and people have accepted that. So people who are pro-Palestinians are against Israel, against Israelis. And Israelis say, well, if I'm not pro-Israel when I'm against Israel, and they go, sure, I'll be pro-Israel, and if being pro-Israel means I have to hate Arabs and Muslims, and I'll hate Arabs and Muslims. So this sort of approach is unhelpful in the extreme. And also, that's also part of why I can understand and actually sympathize with moderate Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims or whatever that are asked to interviews and then constantly are bombarded with, but don't you oppose what Hamas did? Because you are pushing them to go, I am pro-Palestine, that means I have to be against Israel, and if I'm against Israel, I have to be pro-Hamas. It's also removing the ability to discuss the complexities of the situation if you are pushed into being the presenter of and defender of one side, which is, again, not helpful. And yes, that does mean that you have to take a both sides approach, which sometimes is good, simply so people will be able to present non-extreme opinions. And speaking of narratives, there's this concept called the bed of Procrustes. Procrustes was a concept from the Greek mythology, where Procrustes invited guests and he let them lay on his bed. If they were too short, he would stretch them like on a rack and, to fit the bed. And if they were too tall, he would cut their legs so they would fit the bed. That is the nature of narratives and ideologies and religions, and ideologies are religions and religions are ideologies, where you look at a situation and you make it fit your preconceived notions. You actually see this a lot on social media. So this is the bed of Procrustes, which I just referenced, or Procrustean bed. Then we go to this tweet by Tony Caron, and I apologize if I butchered his name. If you believe whatever the Israelis tell you, you're not a journalist, just a hasbara volunteer. By the way, hasbara literally means explaining, not some evil and insidious thing. As Dana says, the IDF literally has a playbook that recommends lying as the first response to news that makes them look bad. Explained here. And you know what? I actually agree with that. If you accept everything the Israeli army tells you without question, then you're not doing your journalistic duty. But you're also not a journalist if you assume everything Israel tells you is false. As a journalist, your job is to say, this is what XYZ had said, like this is what Israel claimed, or this is what Hamas claimed, such as with how many casualties they have. And then your job is to check, to verify it, to try and find out the truth and report that, whatever it is, whether it fits your narrative or not. Because as a journalist, well, I guess this is a distinction between a journalist and a reporter, but a reporter should report the truth. A journalist who writes op-eds does tend to focus on the facts that fit their narrative, which is exactly the Procrustes bed situation. Like they just ignore things that don't fit their narrative. So going from that, there are a lot of people who, interestingly, speak from both sides of their mouth about Israel. Like they say, Israel is so weak, when they'll go into Gaza, they'll get beaten. Like Israel is so weak, they're about to fall apart. But on the other hand, they say, Israel is so strong, what they're doing is not fair. It's not fair how they're using their military supremacy to rain death upon the helpless Palestinians. You can't do that. You can't say both Israel is strong and Israel is weak in the same sentence just to fit your narrative. And the same thing actually fits the topic of believing Israeli officials. Like every time they say something that doesn't fit the narrative of, let's say, Israel cares about Palestinian civilians, when it is just brushed away as a lie, or if Israel claims that, let's say, Hamas or the Islamic Jihad is responsible for bombing a hospital, and clearly that's a lie. But if an Israeli official says something that you disagree with, then clearly it is to be believed and taken at face value because it fits your narrative. Either you take all of it with a grain of salt, or you believe all of it. You can't just believe or disbelieve everything one side says. Back when Al-Ahli hospital was bombed or exploded, or had the explosion, there was a person who was hired by Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, who made a tweet about the situation. That person is not an official employee of Israel. He is the personal digital spokesperson of Bibi. He has no access to clandestine information, and people immediately grabbed his tweet where he said he's sorry for the explosion, as if it truly showed that Israel admitted the responsibility for the bombing. But that is not the case. Like, you can't take just whatever people say that fits your narrative and ignore everything else the same people say as false, and vice versa. That's dishonest, intellectually dishonest in general. And going from that, we go again to social media. So Caitlin Johnston, that's actually a good example of what I just said. You go into a war zone, the sides fighting there tell you, we can't guarantee your safety. It doesn't matter if you have the saying press or medical personnel. This is an active war zone. You can't go in. Just like when there's a bomb squad, they don't let anyone in, and they can't let, let's say, a reporter in, and it is not a threat. So before we go onward, I also want to touch about some people. Like Caitlin Johnston is someone who really cares about this topic, and I don't say this with any sense of sarcasm or cynicism. So I want to show you for a moment her social blade. She had gained roughly 8% more followers over the last 30 days. As you can see, this is when the Hamas attack happened. As you can see, up to it, she tended to gain around 100 people per day. And since then, she'd gained a lot more, about 1,500 to 2,000 people per day. Okay? This is just to give you a baseline. I have no problem with people following and supporting Caitlin Johnston. I may not necessarily agree with anything or everything she says, but people are allowed to disagree. Let's talk about Jackson Hinkle. Jackson Hinkle is a grifter. See, his goal here is simply to make money. He is a Russian puppet, even. He has plenty of images of him with Putin, which he photoshopped to be together. Not sexually, but, like in the same place. He argues for Russian interests. He is not anti-Israel because he's pro-Palestine, but because this is what fits the Russian narrative, and because it makes him money. If you look here to October 7th, he gained on average, let's say, 100 followers per day. And since then, he had gained on average 45,000 followers, and he's milking it for all it's got. He has gained 266% more followers than in the last 30 days. Let's talk about Lucas Gage. Lucas Gage is an anti-Semite. And I don't say this because he opposes Israel, quite the reverse. He opposes Israel because he is an anti-Semite. He doesn't oppose Israel because he supports the Palestinians. He supports the Palestinians because he opposes Israel, because he opposes Jews. The people who killed JFK, RFK, stole tech, care sailors, activists and journalists, success, blah, blah, blah. He's talking about Jews here. Here he is again. So long as we let the Jewish supremacists divide us, they will win. This is again about how the Jews try to take over the world. Lucas Gage, you can see him, miscegenation, and rather than a coalition against a common enemy that has destroyed all our homelands, you've been successfully divided and conquered by right-wing figures such as Tommy Robinson who work for Zionism. He's talking about the Jews. I don't buy into this so-called Jewish anti-Zionism. The only difference between a Zionist Jew and an anti-Zionist Jew is when they're allowed to subjugate the Gentiles. Excellent PDF on how Jewish bankers took over finance. They hate Hitler because he stood up against the banking cartel and communism. Watch this with an open mind. Literally supporting Nazism. Zionist Jews killed JFK. Yeah, this is Sam Parker. We'll go over for in a moment. So Lucas Gage, let's say an average of 150, 200 people every day until the 7th. And since then, the average is closer to 2,200. These people, him and Jackson Hinkle and Sam Parker, who spread a blood libel about how the Jews created the war in Ukraine, trying to eliminate the Ukrainians so they could take over Ukraine. And we'll just show him real quickly, real fast. Let's say 50 to 300 people per day before October 7th, and since then, most days are 400 and more to 1,500. So why am I showing this? I'm showing this because it is important to understand that the narratives that are spun have agendas. And like I've seen someone who runs an account with over 1 million followers that is strictly about science, has nothing to do with politics. Follow all of these accounts. Follow Sam Parker, follow Luke. Okay, and yeah, this is something Sam Parker retweeted as well. The lights, he retweeted this, which referenced him. The lights are wrecking America, and they're obviously Jewish, and people don't talk about it because they would get cancelled by Nick Fuentes, who is a neo-Nazi and white supremacist. Jew, and by the way, not how he always writes it differently. Jew explains how they divide and conquer non-Jews, promote division amongst Gentiles, foster unity amongst themselves for persecution, go on offense. So he's not anti-Zionist, he's anti-Jew. And Lucas Gage, by the way, tends to retweet Sam Parker quite a bit. These people don't support Palestine, or they support Palestine because they hate the Jewish people. They've been getting a lot of traction since October 7th. I've seen people who follow all of these accounts. They follow a lot of accounts that post material that is pro-Palestine and or anti-Israel, because as we discussed earlier, with a push to the extremes, people don't separate the two. And they end up following rabid neo-Nazis who clearly don't actually support Arabs and Muslims. Be careful who you follow. Be advised that right now you are following all of these people because they say something you agree with, or they propagate a message that supports a cause that you believe in, but after they will push the people who followed them to be more extreme. Instead, if someone was pro-Palestine and not anti-Israel, there is a greater chance that they will be pushed to be anti-Israel, anti-Jews. By the way, speaking of which, if you are pro-Palestine, you have to be pro-Israel. And if you are pro-Israel, you have to be pro-Palestine. There will only be peace when both sides live side by side and both sides benefit from it and are successful and safe within their borders. There can't be a Jewish state of Israel without there being a Palestinian state. at its side, and there can't be a Palestinian state without there being a Jewish state, unless you propose a federation or a biracial country, and then you can just look at what happened in Yugoslavia and in most such situations where it has not gone well and is actually not desired by the majority on either side right now. So it is important to be careful who you follow. Going further about the concept of social media, there are other risks in following social media. There is such a thing called secondary trauma, and then secondary post-trauma stress disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder that happen due to a secondary source. A secondary source means that you weren't exposed to the trauma directly, but let's say you went and looked at all the atrocities on social media, and you shouldn't, because those atrocities can harm your psyche, they can harm you. It's not a good thing to be exposed to human remains, to the cruelty that humans are capable of. And I remember that I woke up on the 7th, and after a while I checked the news, as I do every day, and then I went and looked on Twitter and saw images and videos of the atrocities committed, and I can tell you that it made me feel quite bad. It made me feel unsafe. It was a sense of trauma. Trauma, both in the philosophical and psychological sense, is a sense of discontinuity. You can also hear it in phrases such as, what the world changed that day. What was is not what will be, which has been used by Israeli politicians and military personnel since October 7th for changing the reality. It is a sense that things changed. And by the by, just as an aside, another term that you might use to describe the exact same situations is singularity, and vice versa. Post-singularity, to those who lived through it, is a trauma. And you can also see it in the Bible, where Moses is told that he can't enter the land of Israel because the generation of the desert carries too much baggage and can't become the new people that are needed in this new land. So that was a singularity and also a trauma for all the Hebrew people who made it through the desert, including Moses. Take care of yourself. More than that, more than the harm it can deal to you directly, it can also make you not consider people as people anymore, or makes you immune to their suffering, because what happens is that you form an emotional scar tissue. You become insensitive to suffering because you got wounded. What is the thick skin? A thick skin is another name for a scarification, and it happens because you keep getting wounded. Speaking of which, in part of what the Israeli military has shown foreign reporters, there was terrorist that called his parents to, I don't know if brag is the correct term, but to tell them to see what he did, what he accomplished, how proud he is of and enthusiastic he is of having killed 10 Jews. And what happens in this, here it is. His parents aren't as excited as he is. From the muted replies, I wonder whether they also understand that even if he did come home, he would do so as a disgusting and degraded creature, and that it might be better for him not to. He has lost his sense of humanity in these actions. He has degraded himself, and in some sense, if you get exposed to too much trauma, this might happen to you as well. So you should take care, and this is by the by also what the Israeli people meant by human beasts, which is a term of phrase in Hebrew, which refers to people, which is also used to soccer hooligans, for instance. It just means people who are not acting civilized, people who have shed the human form, so to speak, which we are created in the form of God. Okay, so we talked about that. A bit more about social media. Yes, unsurprisingly, this is a site called NewsGuard. I will put a link to it in the description. NewsGuard is a site that tries to keep track of misinformation in the news. Blue-checked verified users on X produce 70% of the platform's most viral false or unsubstantiated claims relating to Israel-Hamas war. Being blue-checked does not mean that you spread less lies. These are some of the lies that we are talking about, and it is covering examples from both sides that have been false. And community notes fail to debunk misinformation almost 70% of the time. It's important to remember that a lot of what you see on X is false. This, for example, is something I reported because it spreads tropes about Jews, such as Mossad, CIA was involved in 9/11, Israel was founded by Nazi collaborator, fascist terrorists. I've made several reports, none of them had been acted upon. Just to give you an idea, let's look at Lucas Gage for a second. I want to show you something. When you report a tweet, let's say I want to report this, you can't report something for spreading incorrect information. That's just not a thing. Twitter doesn't care about incorrect information. As you can see, not like I have an option of adding a community note. It is not something that is available to everyone. Only specific people have that option, and it is not public information. Oh, right. Speaking of false narratives, the top is 9/11. Israel is responsible for both. Israel is responsible for 9/11, supposedly. Like, you can't even report that. I can't add a community note, do anything about it, you know? And if I were to report it for hate, nothing will happen because slurs and tropes is the closest it can go, or maybe incitement, like spreading fear against me or a group of people because of their identity. But Twitter doesn't do anything about that. It's important to be aware of all of these things as you consume information on Twitter, and honestly, you shouldn't. I will also link a video by Ian Bremmer, who was interviewed by Michael Costa on The Tonight Show, and he had quite a good take, so to speak, on the whole thing. And he said that social media, aside from spreading lies and hatred and extremism and trauma, isn't conducive. It's just making you hate other people. It's making you not see people as people. India and Pakistan on October 7th had a proxy war on Twitter. All the Pakistani were anti-Israel. All of the Indians, meaning people from India, not Native Americans, were pro-Israel. And of course, they weren't pro-Israel because they support Israel. They were pro-Israel because they are anti-Muslims. So that just goes to show you that just as there are neo-Nazis that support Palestine because they hate Jews, there are also, by the way, neo-Nazis that think Islam is the greatest enemy of the Western culture, and that's, by the way, something that is more prevalent in Europe. And so they support Israel and oppose the Palestinians, not because they actually care about Israel. They would hate Jews and will return to them after they solve their Muslim problem. So they only support Israel because they are against the other side and enemy of my enemy. That's something to keep in mind. But this inability to see the other side as human manifests in the real world. There have been Israelis and Jews abroad who have set up flyers of the kidnapped civilians in various places. If you are a decent person, if you're a humane human, you obviously realize that innocent civilians shouldn't be killed, innocent civilians shouldn't be kidnapped. But you see people in major cities in Europe and in the United States, such as New York City, London, and others, tear off flyers of kidnapped civilians. How can you be against the return of innocent civilians? Cruelty to humans, whoever they are. How? Because you don't see them as human anymore, and you have been brainwashed into believing that if you are for one side, you are against the other side. And that you can't allow people to see, let's say, the humanity or the terrible plight of people in Israel or Gaza, because then you are undermining the other, your side, so to speak. So another example is there was an Arab shop in Israel, an Israeli Arab shop, bicycle shop, that donated 30 pairs of bicycles to Israeli children who lived around Gaza and evacuated to the north. That's a very humane act. Innocent children who had just been deeply traumatized because they were inside these towns that were attacked on October 7th. So he gave them some bicycles. What happened? His shop was burned down, probably by other Arabs. There were people on October 7th who cheered for the Hamas massacre, and they chanted from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. By the by, what do you think from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free means? Who will it be free from? I mean, it will be free from Jews. That's literally calling for genocide. How can you say that you oppose Israel because it performs a genocide on the Palestinians and then call for a genocide, for a mass displacement of the Jewish people in Israel, or to dismantle their state, which is, by the by, one of the definitions of genocide, trying to dismantle a group identity of a certain group of people. These people are quite like COVID deniers. What do I mean by that? Well, remember our narrative and our procrastination bed? Well, COVID deniers first said, COVID isn't a big deal. Nothing will happen. And they said, masks, they won't do anything. The vaccine, it won't help. In fact, that is how we're spreading COVID. So it's not people who, were pro, let's say, locking everyone inside and then were pro-mask until masks were proven ineffective and weren't anti-vaccines until vaccines were proven ineffective. No, which would be irrational. Like, let's say someone who believes COVID is a big deal, was pro-mask, and then was anti-vaccines, without being anti-vaccines in general, okay? That didn't happen. Most of the COVID deniers have been COVID deniers all along. Every time they just moved what they are opposing. Likewise, while a lot of people oppose Israel on real grounds, we have people who cheered for the Hamas massacre on October 7th. And this is actually important because it explains the siege mentality, let's say, of Israelis, because and Jewish people all over the world, they see all these people who were cheering on October 7th, who said Israel is to blame for the murder of its civilians. So they go, sure, first you were pro-Hamas, and now that you decry Israeli atrocity, and we'll get to that. And I do think there are Israeli atrocities happening, but we'll get to that later. Now, you aren't actually opposing the atrocities by Israel. You were always anti-Israel, and you're just now moving what you're opposing, how you're justifying your hatred of Israel, your support of Hamas. So all of those people who cheered on October 7th hate Israel, and they will hate Israel regardless of what Israel does, and they're just finding new material to go after Israel with. And that brings us to some of the discussion that happened, that I saw on social media early on. If you deny humanity to the other side, it requires losing your own humanity. That's something I think after seeing some of the discussion on social media, especially in the early days, like I've seen people who argued that there weren't any innocent Israelis in the October 7th massacres, not in the party, not living around Gaza, because Israel has a mandatory draft. So that 5-year-old was murdered, or that baby who was murdered, will one day grow up to be a soldier. So they could be killed. Or someone who was a soldier, let's say someone who is 70 years old, but was a soldier 50 years ago. So that means it's okay to kill them. And on the other side, there are Israelis who say not everyone who participated in the October 7th massacres has been a Hamas operative. Some of them were simply opportunists who went to loot and rape and pillage when given the opportunity. So they say, well, there are no innocents in Gaza. Any child might grow up to be a terrorist, or even if not a terrorist, they will still be a barbarian. So, and you can see how these denials of humanity to the other side are horrific. So denying this humanity to the other side, you prove yourself to be inhuman. Or also early on there was Shani Luke. Shani Luke is a German who partied in the Nova party on October 7th and who was captured on video showing her being taken on the back of a car to Gaza, stripped, mostly naked, with her face down on the back of a truck, and Gazan civilians gathering around and spitting at her and such. Early on, the anti-Israelis cheered for it. Then it was revealed that she is a German citizen, and there was a specific pro-Israeli Twitter account who tried castigating the Hamas supporters or the Palestinian supporters with that, how they killed a German person, and then the pro-Palestinian side or anti-Israeli side tried to argue, no, this is fine because she's actually someone who supports Israel or has Israeli friends. And this whole discussion is honestly terrible. This discussion is horrific. Like, what does it matter if she were an Israeli or not? Like, is it okay to kill her if she's an Israeli, but not okay to kill her if she's a German tourist? And let's say she's a German tourist. Does it make it more okay to kill her, more justified because she supports Israel? What sort of demented mentality is that, right? That's crazy. And likewise, I actually find the same discussion. People keep bringing up how many children have been killed. This is definitely a war over narrative, but does it actually matter? Like, if a civilian dies, does it matter if they were a woman or 40-year-old or 20-year-old or 2 years old? Does it really matter if an innocent dies? Which were they? No, it doesn't. That's only an argument over atrocity metrics, so to speak. A child is worth 1.5 women and 2 men. An elderly is worth 1.2 men. Like, that's the sort of discussion that is ongoing. But also, what sort of discussion is that? That also brings us to the discussion on proportionality, which I'm going to perform a reductio ad absurdum. I'm going to show you how ridiculous the discussion on proportionality is. On October 7th, there were 1,400 casualties in Israel. Not all of them were Israeli civilians. Some of them had been foreign civilians. And we also had roughly 220 or something like that people kidnapped by Hamas. So let's look at proportionality. Let's say that all 1,400 people had been civilians. Does it mean that it's fine for Israel to go and execute 1,400 Palestinian civilians? Let's say 300 of the 1,400 had been children. Is it okay for Israel to go, collect 300 Gazan children and execute them? Because that would be proportional, right? And let's look at rockets. Let's say Hamas fired let's say 5,000 missiles. Does that mean that Israel is allowed to fire 5,000 missiles back? But then you go, no, because Israel has the Iron Dome. Only 50 missiles actually landed in Israel. Does that mean that Israel is permitted to and should, in the name of proportionality, take 50 missiles and bomb structures directly, exactly 50? And let's say that one of the missiles hit a hospital in Israel, which it did, by the by. Does that mean that Israel is permitted, and even should, in the name of the almighty proportionality, actively missile a hospital? You know what? Let's go further. Gilad Shalit was an Israeli soldier who was kidnapped in 2006. He was released in 2011 for 1,027 Hamas prisoners. So by this key that Hamas created, each Israeli civilian or casualty is worth 1,027 Palestinian civilians. So for the murder of 1,400 Israeli civilians and residents and soldiers, 1.4 million Gazans should be killed. That's what proportionality is telling us. Now, in case it's not clear, this is a reductio ad absurdum. I'm showing you that the whole notion of proportionality and measuring atrocities, and you see this on social media as well, like on October 7th, I saw a video of a Hamas drone dropping a bomb on an Israeli ambulance. We knew it was an ambulance, and we dropped a bomb directly on it on purpose, which is a war crime. And then people on the other side say, well, Israel has no compunction against bombing hospitals. It's okay, this is justified. But of course, this goes back and forth, because when Israel goes, you bombed a hospital in Ashkelon or Ashdod, I don't remember which hospital was bombed last week in Israel. So Israel goes, or Israel supporters go, well, you bombed our hospital, you bombed our ambulances. It's only fair for us to bomb your hospital or ambulance. This is how blood feuds happen. Like, you have to stop it at some point, and the whole concept of proportionality doesn't make sense from a human suffering perspective. There's a saying in Judaism that goes, every person is an entire world unto itself. That means that every person that dies is a whole world that had been snuffed out, that has gone out. And atrocities don't excuse one another. It doesn't work like that. How much life is a human life worth? A systematic review. I will also link this below. Governmental agencies put a price on human life when they decide whether some measurement is worth it or not. By the way, big companies do it as well when they decide whether to do a recall or not, let's say on a car issue safety, where they decide or make financial sense. So in 2018 in the US, so a human life was worth roughly 5.7 million. A missile of Iron Dome system costs about $50,000. So that's 104 interceptor missiles. Some days in Israel, thousands are used. Does that mean that for every 114 missiles that Israel uses to defend its population, it is allowed to kill a Palestinian? Of course not. Going from that topic to Iron Dome and defensive measures in general, countries are expected to protect their people. Soldiers are given bulletproof vests. They are given helmets. But why do we do that? Because it hurts proportionality. Like, should we take off protective vests so there would be an equal level of arms to both sides? Should we allow more people on our side to die so we could kill more people on the other side? Or that obviously doesn't make sense, also not in a legal sense. Like, if someone tries to kill you, you don't act as if, like, let's say someone tried to kill you, but you go, oh, my bulletproof vest stopped it. I only got, a tiny bruise. So I guess I can poke him with my finger. That's the extent of what I can do to them. No, you try to kill me. I'm going to punish you, put you in jail for attempted murder, not for bruising me. And if we go by that sense, look at the Hamas rockets. Yes, the Hamas mortar rockets are badly aimed, and most of them get intercepted. But each of them tried to kill civilians. Not only that, you can go Israel bombed 22 hospitals over the last week, but in a way, every Hamas missile had been targeting a hospital or a synagogue or a kindergarten or what have you. Because potentially, because they're so badly aimed, each of them has been. So that also puts a wrench in the proportionality. Do we just judge it by the result? As we just saw from our attempted murder example, that's false. For every missile that they shot was an attempted murder of civilians and bombing hospitals and so on and so forth. So is Israel permitted to, in the name of proportionality, to bomb a hospital, let's say, for every missile that Hamas shot, regardless of what it hit? Now, we still have a sense that proportionality is important. If someone kicks you in the shin, you would say that killing him as a response is out of proportion, or a disproportionate response. But it's important to understand that it is very limited, because of what is attempted on one side, and second, because as I've gone over extensively earlier, how do you exact that proportional response? And by the way, like, here's the question: is it more or less immoral to aim at a hospital and hit a hospital? And this is an open question, by the way. It's not something I have a clear-cut answer for. For instance, if you bomb a hospital, you know you bombed the hospital. But if you don't aim at all, you should consider that every missile you've sent is potentially one that had hit or would hit a hospital. And if you send thousands of rockets and all thousands of them have a chance of hitting a hospital, then which is worse, bombing 22 hospitals or potentially bombing thousands of hospitals or hospitals thousands of times, but only succeeding once? And does it actually matter? I don't know. That's quite a dilemma. Another thing I keep seeing people speak about on social media, on streams, on YouTube videos, is how Amy Schumer mentioned that how can you come to Israel with demands when there are still kidnapped people in Gaza, civilians? Demand Hamas to release them. And then people say, well, Hamas isn't releasing them because of the war. It can't, right? Well, that's not quite true. Gilad Shalit, as we discussed earlier, was kidnapped in 2006 and was released in 2011. So in 2008, there was an operation by Israel. In 2008 to 2009, there was the Gaza war. There were more events on March 2010, in August 2011, and only then, in October of 2011, was Gilad Shalit released. So clearly, it is not that Hamas wants to release those civilians or the kidnapped people, but can't. But Guy, you say, Gilad Shalit was a soldier. Hamas isn't going to release the soldiers even now, only the civilians. Well, let's look at Avraham Mengistu. Avraham Mengistu was kidnapped too. He's an Israeli Ethiopian man who suffers from mental illness and crossed into Gaza of his own volition on September 7th, 2014. In case you are wondering, he is still there. You see, each of these events is something that happened. Gaza war, that's July. He crossed after that, so not relevant. Okay, border protests in 2018, clashes in November 2018, May 2018, November 2018, clashes, April 2021, May 2021 with Operation Breaking Dawn on August 5th, 2022. So what stopped Hamas from releasing Avraham Mengistu, who is a mentally ill civilian, all this time? Clearly, it is not this war that All right, April 2023, May 2023. Clearly, it's not the clashes that have begun on October 7th that have stopped Hamas from releasing him, right? So, that's part of what I said earlier with regards to making excuses and finding a narrative that it fits. Remember what we talked about Jackson Hinkle, the pro-Russian side? So we have people say how Israel attacked Gaza, it attacked Lebanon, it attacked Syria. It's trying to create a regional war. Well, are these people mentioning how Hezbollah in Lebanon and someone from Syria had actually shot rockets into Israel before Israel had responded? No, because it doesn't fit their narrative of Israel that is against all Muslims, against all Arab nations, and trying to destabilize the situation. Having mentioned how all of these groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Syrian regime, Houthis in Yemen, which also launched attacks towards Israel, are all supported by Iran. Iran, who is actually a chief ally of Russia and has gained more prominence since because Russia relies on its drones and arms manufacture for its war in Ukraine? No, because it doesn't fit the narrative. But it's important to remember both in how it ties to people's agenda and how they spin the narrative, but they have an agenda. But another mini discussion would be the ceasefire discussion. People try to paint Israel as terrible because it rejected a ceasefire with Hamas, or calls for a ceasefire. Hamas itself did not ask for a ceasefire, and there was also a resolution in the UN early last night, which Israel rejected, calling for an immediate ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. So let me ask you a question. Putting aside for a moment where it all started, like a discussion that I will get to at another date because it really does demand its own discussion. Let's say that you have a neighbor. This neighbor punches you in the face. You get up, you're about to swing this back. A third neighbor steps in between the two of you and calls for you to be the bigger man, to be the adult, and not to swing back. You fume, but you accept it, and you don't punch back. A month passes. This neighbor punches you again. A neighbor who stepped in last time steps in again, and he goes, "Don't punch him." You fume, you mutter and curse, but you don't punch him. Then your neighbor, another month passes, and this neighbor punches you again. The other neighbor comes and tells you once more, be cool, don't punch him. It won't help anything. Now, from a term of, in terms of, now this is a dilemma, because clearly in terms of human sacrifice and suffering, it would be better for you to keep turning the other cheek and keep getting punched. But we all know that the instinct and also in some sense the logical response to make your punching neighbor stop is you have to punch him back. Not just punch him back, you have to punch him and repay him threefold because he has punched you 3 times, and you want to make sure that this will not repeat. So in terms of human suffering, obviously it is better to not retaliate because, as mentioned earlier, this is how cycles of bloodshed propagate or even begin, but it isn't in human nature to not respond. Distributive injustice is one of the shared aspects of human cultures around the world, and you can say that if someone punches you, they deserve to be punched back, right? As a form of distributive justice, though you have to squint a bit, I guess. What do you do? And another thing that people mention is how China and Russia called for a ceasefire, both here and in Ukraine, but America opposed it. So I just presented one way in which a ceasefire is not fair or not necessarily even humane, because let's say, should Hamas be allowed to, let's say, murder 1,400 civilians and then nothing be done in return? Because we agree that proportionality is meaningless, and let's say killing people, even one on the Palestinian side, is more suffering in the world than there was previously. So should you just do nothing? Would that be fair? And that also shows you how fairness has little to do necessarily with what is optimally best, so to speak. So that call for a ceasefire, like you can't attack the other side and then immediately cry, uncle, don't do anything to me, right? And the other situation in Ukraine is a different case. They wanted a ceasefire after Russia had invaded eastern Ukraine. What does a ceasefire mean then? A ceasefire then would just mean giving up on eastern Ukraine. So China, being the one that is calling for ceasefire in both situations, it doesn't mean, and America opposing it, it doesn't mean that a ceasefire is always valid. Like let's say, you know what? Here's an example. Let's say that Israel nuked Gaza, or let's say that Israel forcibly moved all Gazans into the Sinai Desert, which is part of Egypt. And then Israel said, no, we want a ceasefire. Would the people who support Palestinians be fine with that? Would people who support Palestinians be fine with Israel, let's say, bombing all Palestinian settlements in the West Bank until the people evacuate, let's say, to Jordan, and then going, no, ceasefire, because that's the sort of ceasefire that China called for in Ukraine, and the one it called for in Gaza is, well, let them slaughter you. So I don't think that valid. Speaking of dilemmas of what you do, let's talk about international law. First of all, this is something that will have its own video. Law is not morality. We can all imagine an immoral law, such as laws in Nazi Germany. Or let's say that we have a law that says that all blonde people have to be killed when they are 12. Okay, that's an immoral law. We can all agree that that something is moral doesn't necessarily mean it's a law. Let's look at, let's say, abortion. Whichever side you are on, you probably believe that whichever side you are on, because the law has changed over time, you can agree that what is moral hasn't always been the case. Now, what is morality is a big issue, but I'm going to mention it very shortly. One common belief is that morality is objective. We don't know what it is. God or the equivalent can know and maybe tell us. In that case, morality is objective, and it doesn't mean if nobody does what is moral, it is still what is moral. And I bring that up because there are a lot of people who say, look how many people support Palestine and how few people support Israel on social media. But if morality is objective, and that is naturally irrelevant, the other main view is that morality is subjective or cultural or relative, which means that what most people consider to be moral is what is moral. But a big problem with that is that it very easily brings us to populism, where we also shut down anyone who disagrees with us, because what is important is not necessarily how many people agree with us, but what is seen as the majority held opinion. There's also a problem with that because, well, Jews are a minority worldwide, and that brings us to discussion about Jews and Muslims, about how we shouldn't have them, because then they spread and so do their opinion. So now that we spoke a bit about law, the international law, especially about crimes against humanity or war crimes, is sort of ridiculous. I'm not saying that there should be no law, but if you look at every armed conflict or nearly every armed conflict since the Second World War, there were massive infringements upon the code, the Geneva Convention, and what is considered war crimes almost every single time. And it's not by accident. Apart from some laws being arbitrary, let's say someone is in a plane, let's say there's a carrier plane for paratroopers, you're allowed to shoot it down. Paratroopers have jumped from a plane, you aren't allowed to shoot them while they're in the air, you have to wait for them to land on the ground, and only then can you shoot them or take them prisoner, right? So this view is, it almost takes war and tries to turn it into a duel, like a medieval duel between two noblemen. By the way, this is how many wars in Europe happen. Armies march, they face off on a battlefield, and there things are resolved without any civilian having to lose their life or even be involved in fighting, besides being drafted, because that's how wars were held. But this is not how wars happen in the 20th and 21st centuries, and it is especially not how guerrilla wars and wars against guerrilla organizations such as Hamas and Hezbollah occur. So you can argue that yes, Gaza is a very densely populated zone, so naturally there will be some crossover between where Hamas is and where the civilians are, but that's not an honest take, because while you could argue that it happens sometimes, you have cases like the Gaza Tower, or in 2000 or in 2021, when there was the tower where where the foreign journalists had their headquarters. These places, not by accident but by design, also have Hamas headquarters. They use the presence of civilian and foreign interests to cover them there. And let's look for a moment. Here we have UNRWA. UNRWA condemns placement of rockets for a second time in one of its schools. Hamas places rockets in schools. It actively operates out of hospitals and mosques. By the way, speaking of which, if that's a question, let's say a bunch of militants operate out of a mosque and an armed force goes in to bring them out, which side is the one that has desecrated the mosque? The one that is using it, or a synagogue or a church? Which side is the one that has desecrated it? Let's say, by the by, that in a Muslim country, a terrorist organization goes into a mosque and the armed forces go in to bring them out. They didn't kill anyone in the mosque, but they took control of it. Everyone will hail the armed forces as heroes. But why is it different when it's different religions? It is because it is treated differently. And also, US criticizes UNRWA for passing rockets to Hamas members. This is what happened after this, by the way. So UNRWA finds rockets in its schools. So what does it do? It gives them to Hamas, which is the terrorist organization that put them there in the first place. And here we have, by the way, UNRWA chief acknowledges anti-Semitism and glorification of terrorism in Palestinian textbooks. I'm bringing this up because on one side, let's say you live in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, or you live in Hamas-controlled Gaza. You can't openly defy the ruling terrorist organization. Not if you value your life and if you have a humanitarian mission. Going acceding to the wishes of a terrorist organization can allow you to do more good. So it is understandable that you might do it. But on the other hand, you have to understand that the civilian population does to some degree cooperate with Hamas in Gaza, and obviously in Israel, the civilian population cooperates and supports the IDF. So what do you do when an organization such as Hamas uses civilian meat shields from a legal perspective, very use of civilians as meat shields is a war crime. Hamas has perpetrated a lot of war crimes and crimes against humanity, both in its attack on Israel, every single day in keeping the kidnapped people kidnapped and denying them from seeing Red Cross personnel. But what do? You are fighting Hamas, and you have two options. You either don't do anything because they are surrounded by civilians, or you bomb them and attack them, and you accept that you will likely hit civilians. So this is a dilemma. What do you do? And this also brings us back to the discussion on the ceasefire and your punching neighbor, because let's say that you don't do anything because you don't want to hit the civilian. And at some point you do have to retaliate, right? And if you argue that you don't, well, in every conflict in the world that had happened, people do retaliate eventually. So the discussion of what the law says here doesn't quite matter, especially if they broke the law first. But it's not like if criminals break the law, we allow the police to break the law. So it is a dilemma. If you have opinions, you should voice them down below. And before we move on, I mentioned trauma a bit earlier with regards to social media, but last Tuesday, a missile actually hit 600 meters from my home. That's roughly, let's say, 700 yards. It crashed a house that I know the people who live there. Every time I do my workout, I pass by the place that was hit. It actually didn't bother me much. It wasn't traumatic for me in the sense that it felt normal. And that might be part of my scarification or my reduced sensitivity, because I remember during the second Intifada, during 2001, every time we would come back from the city or from relatives, my parents would wake my siblings and I, so we would be awake and alert in case our car would get shot at. The high school when I went to high school, there was a suicide bombing at the nearby mall that was, I don't know, like 500 meters away. And these things didn't really reduce my sense of security. But I do remember back around 2021, when there were a lot of lone knife men in Israel, but as I walked in the city, I sometimes thought that I should look around me and be aware in case someone were to come and try and knife me down. So that's, to some degree, my sense of normalcy. So let's talk about genocide. Genocide. Is Israel performing a genocide in Gaza? Well, first of all, we have the legal definition of genocide. The legal definition is quite contentious, so it's not very helpful. But if we look at the colloquial sense of genocide, I would argue that Israel is very much not performing a genocide in Gaza. The way I think of a genocide is removing most of the population, or removing a large swath of the population. By the way, to say something is decimated is to lose 10%, because that is usually when a society collapses or an army unit collapses, when they lose 10%. Okay? So if we look at some of the history of the Jews in Europe, it is estimated that 57% of the Jews in Europe perished during the Holocaust. That's a genocide. Like in Poland, 88%, in Hungary, 60%, 87% in Yugoslavia, 75% in Latvia, 50% in Albania, only 33% in Germany. Only, right? 33% in Germany. This is a genocide. We have the Darfur. Well, this is called the Darfur genocide. 300,000 killed out of 6 million, roughly, during that time. That is, in case you are wondering, 5%. But 2.7 million displaced civilians. You add this together and it is 50%. See, this is Darfur, around that time, before the conflict, Darfur had an ethnically mixed population of around 6 million. Armenia. On the eve of World War I, there were 2 million Armenians in the declining Ottoman Empire. By 1922, there were fewer than 400,000. However, some 1.5 million were killed in what historians consider genocide. That's three-fourths, 75%. Now let's look at the demographics of the state of Palestine. West Bank. This is the per annum growth rate per year here of 2.5 roughly. Gaza about 3.4 per year per annum. And in 2023 there was an estimated 2.3 million. That does not look like a genocide to me. Now we can argue that the displacement in 1948 was an act of genocide, though I think displacement is a bit dilutive to the term. By looking at this, there is also the Uyghur genocide in China, which I'm referencing because some people call Gaza the world's largest open-air prison. I'd say that Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs are, is considerably larger. How large is it exactly? 1.6 million square kilometers or 640 square miles, relative to the Gaza Strip of 365 square kilometers. Another larger open-air prison is North Korea. They are prisoners of their own regime, but since the regime is not democratic, they are prisoners of it. And if we look at the growth per year of various countries, we have Palestine up here, very close to its neighboring Egypt and Israel. So how exactly is this a genocide? Like killing members of a group, sure, but are enough people being killed? Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of a group is one of the prohibited acts and defining acts of genocide, just mass rape, or terrorist acts. That's why I brought it up. This also brings up a question of intent. Is bombing a city is going to cause serious mental harm to the people that live there naturally? It also happened in Dresden and other such situations. But is it the intent to cause the mental harm to the civilians, or is it a byproduct? Now, you could argue either way. That's both legally and morally. By the way, the legal argument that isn't too interesting to me because both it is contentious, and because, as we discussed, legality and morality aren't necessarily correlated. So, but when Hamas keeps shooting rockets at the people who live on the outskirts of Gaza, the Israeli civilians, whether Jewish or the Bedouin, that is intended to cause harm, including mental harm. This is what terrorism is. Terrorism is a genocidal act, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. This is a big point of contention. Is Israel responsible to the conditions of life in Gaza? And if Israel is responsible, what about Egypt? Did you know that Gaza was part of Egypt until 1967? Yes, Israel conquered Gaza, and Israelis lived in the Gaza Strip from 1967 up to 2006, and then Israel withdrew. So people say, so why is Israel responsible to the well-being of the people of Gaza? How is it an open-air prison by Israel? And again, if it's by Israel, what about Egypt? So putting aside the question of Egypt for a moment, I do agree that Israel bears some responsibility because Israel doesn't allow, like with the Marmara flotilla coming from Turkey, Israel does blockade Gaza. It does stop Gaza from receiving all sorts of materials, and so you can't say that Gaza is an independent territory so that Israel could say that it has no responsibility, which is why I'm not surprised that some people in Israel have already said that after the current offensive, the plan is to withdraw from Gaza entirely and leave Gaza to its own devices without any responsibility from Israel. Bringing us back to the question of, genocide. We are going to return to this momentarily, but imposing measures intend to prevent births within the group. Naturally, as I've shown you with the figures, Israel is not preventing births within Gaza, and in fact, Gaza is one of the growth rate within Gaza is one of the higher ones in the world. Possibly transferring children of a group to another group. There is no forced assimilation of Gazans in Israel, Egypt, West Bank, or anywhere else, and there is no such transfer of children in the West Bank either. And the West Bank also isn't prevented from birth. Okay, but let's talk about Liechtenstein. One of the reasons I'm bringing up Liechtenstein is because if we bring up Israel and Palestine, Israel and Gaza, everyone has preconceived notions. So we need to look at a hypothetical with a neutral party that none of us has any real opinion on. Yeah, I misspelled it. So Liechtenstein. Liechtenstein is smaller than Gaza Strip. It's 160 square kilometers, which is 100 square miles, which is less than half the size of the Gaza Strip. It's much less populous. It lies between Austria and Switzerland. So let's say that Liechtenstein can't support its needs. Okay? Let's say that Liechtenstein started a war with both Austria and Switzerland. It receives all of its food and electricity from these countries. These countries are at war with Liechtenstein. Liechtenstein is an enemy state. The population will suffer for it, but are they mandated to provide Liechtenstein with water and electricity? Despite the fact that Liechtenstein started the war, why? Why do they have to provide Liechtenstein's need? That again reminds us of the punching neighbor. Like, you can't start hostilities and then complain when people retaliate. You say collective punishment, but at some point, so what? Is it morally wrong? You know that the people there will suffer if you deny them water, food, and electricity, naturally. But are you required to provide goods to a country you are at war with? And if we are talking about collective punishment, what do you think we are doing to the Russians and North Koreans and Iranians when we have sanctions? What do you think sanctions are? Sanctions are exactly collective punishment, but are intended to reduce the quality of life in certain countries. Yes, these countries still receive the basic human necessities. Let's say that every person in North Korea used to get one bag of chocolate every month, and now we are getting half. That's collective punishment. No, we don't need to receive chocolate to live, and it is not a requirement for life. It is not a basic need, but it is still collective punishment. So, is Israel required to provide Gaza? Are Switzerland and Austria required in our hypothetical to provide Liechtenstein with basic necessities? And if Israel permits basic necessities to come in through Egypt, why does it have to support itself? See, why do people, at least online, still consider Israel a conquering force with responsibility for Gaza? Israel is not the one maintaining the Rafah crossing. Yes, it does have an agreement with Egypt, but Egypt is maintaining that one. Isn't it enough for Israel to require everything that goes in and out of Gaza to pass through Egypt? And let's say that Israel and Egypt lift the blockade of the Gazan port. Would Israel still have any responsibility for the Gazan people if Gaza can import whatever it needs, including fuel, through its port. So Hamas keeps shooting rockets, speaking of fuel. Where do you think this fuel comes from? This is the fuel that was brought in for humanitarian purposes, and this fuel can be repurposed to humanitarian purposes. There is fuel in Gaza under Hamas control. So that's a dilemma, because there are civilians there, and even the Hamas terrorists are still human beings. I don't support torture. If you kill an animal, for instance, for food, you should kill it quickly and as painlessly as possible. I don't believe that torture, especially by starvation, is a good thing, no matter of whom. The fact that someone else does an inhuman act doesn't mean bring us a full circle to the balance of atrocity. If someone else does something atrocious, performs an atrocity, it doesn't mean that you should. Your humanity is measured exactly in not responding in kind. So even if everyone in Gaza were a terrorist, a Hamas operative, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying even if, it doesn't mean that Israel should starve them, because that would be very inhuman. So from a moral standpoint, Israel should alleviate the human suffering in Gaza. But I don't think that you can make a claim that Israel is making a crime against humanity or an illegal act by punishing the Gazan population, because why does Israel have any obligation towards them? Now I'm going to discuss a couple of tiny points before I close this discussion. Many of them are responsive to things I've seen others mention. Biden, there's a move online on Twitter, a hashtag called Genocide Joe, and some people are saying when Biden and the Democrats lose in the next election, they will know this was their fault. I remember how I mentioned that quite a few of the people mongering this hatred on Twitter are either pro-Russian or literal neo-Nazis and MAGA supporters. Well, so now these people are pushing forward the narrative of Genocide Joe. Why? So during next elections in 2024, all of the people disenfranchised with Joe Biden's actions in the Middle East will not go out and vote, and Trump will go back in power. Do you think that Trump is better for Muslims in America or elsewhere in the world than Trump? No, he isn't. This is the Russians trying to get Trump back in power, or the MAGA supporters trying to get Trump back in power. And let's say that you are a Muslim, an American Muslim or Arab, that is propagating the Genocide Joe and this, I'm not going to vote. That is a cowardly action, because inaction is action. You can't just go, I didn't vote, this isn't my fault, or it's his fault. What are you going to say when Trump is in power and persecutes you and your community? Are you going to say, oh no, it's not my fault that Trump is in power, it's Joe Biden's fault for making me not vote for him? That's literally this meme. Voting Trump in by not voting for Biden, and then blaming Joe Biden for your being persecuted. You can't just not take action and say that you rinsed your hands of it. You have to pick between two sides, and you have to pick the side that you think is a lesser evil. It's just like how some Democrats who supported Bernie Sanders in 2016 didn't vote for Hillary, and then Trump got in. Do you think Trump is better than Hillary would have been? If not, then what you did was a travesty. You can't just do that, and you have to remember that part of the narrative, again, is being pushed by people who are pro-Trump or pro-Russia. Also, a tiny point, people say, how is Israel acting in the West Bank right now? There is no Hamas in the West Bank. Well, of course there is. Hamas and Fatah are organizations. It's like saying that a red state has no Democratic voters, or that a blue state has no Republican voters. There are Hamas operatives in the West Bank. And by the way, I'm not saying everything Israel does is right, especially not in the West Bank or by the settlers in the illegal settlements. But the last thing I want to discuss is anti-Zionist Jews or Orthodox Jews. You see them in Iran even, and people bring them up. You see, even Jews, even Orthodox Jews are against the state of Israel. Now, remember how I said it doesn't matter if Shani Luke was an Israeli or a German. It doesn't matter if you kill a child or a woman or a man in his prime. Why does it matter if someone who supports Palestine is a Jew or a Muslim or a Christian? Why does it matter if someone who opposes Israel, let's say, is an ultra-Orthodox Jew? It's because of the narrative. And also, these aren't just Jews, they look Jewish. So they fit the narrative. It's almost an anti-Semitic use of them because they're not only Jewish, they look stereotypically Jewish. But here's the secret. These people, just like the neo-Nazi who supports Palestine because he hates Jews, and the pro-Russian puppet who supports Palestine because he opposes American interests, these Jews, by the way, there are a lot of Jewish people who support Palestine or support peace. Remember what I said? If you support Israel, you should support Palestine, and if you support Palestine, you should support Israel. But there are a lot of Jewish people who do support Palestinian rights, but these ultra-Orthodox Jews are not these. They support Palestinians because they oppose Israel. Like, you don't really think that these people who go on a stage in Iran and support the regime that is torturing and murdering its civilians in the thousands is the greatest defender of human rights, right? So they believe that the Jewish people should not return to Israel, or if they return to Israel, they shouldn't have a state of their own until the Messiah returns, and then God will plonk down the third temple on Al-Aqsa mosque, destroying it, and then there will be a Jewish religious state. So they don't support Palestinian rights. They oppose Israel. They oppose Israel, so they support its enemies, or those they perceive as its enemies. There was one more thing I wanted to discuss before that. For the genocide, though, remember what I said earlier? You can't be against genocide, but support the genocide of Israelis by saying that either Israeli should be killed or displaced, or the Israeli identity should be removed. Each of these fits the legal definition of genocide, and killing Israelis, obviously, for being Israeli, killing Israeli Jews for being Israeli Jews is definitely a genocidal act. I have one more dilemma. The kidnapped people, do you hold off on acting against Hamas when you know they might hold the Israeli civilians for many years? Like Abraham Mengistu has been languishing in Hamas hold for 9 years, and during this time they will continue aggressing against Israel? Or do you go in knowing that your civilians might die? Adding to the fact is that Israel's Zionist line treats it as a patriotic duty to live on the borders, defending Israel from its enemies, being the first line of alarm, so to speak. So these people have an unwritten contract with the country that they will be protected. So what do you do now? And then you have some people, including some families of kidnapped civilians, say that Israel should do what it has to do to remove Hamas, to destroy it, to dismantle it, no matter what the cost is to the kidnapped civilian. most of the people who are saying this are religious Zionists. There is one place where they are mirrored with, I don't know, Hamas certainly, but also other Palestinians, and some would say Muslims, but I don't want to make such a broad sweeping generalization, in that to some degree they are both death cults. They both value the land over the people. Like the religious Zionists say that if people died on the land, it makes the land holy. We can't give up this holy land that we have shed blood for. And if people die for the land, then what we need to do is respond by building on top of it. Now, I don't agree with it in the West Bank because that's like saying someone who, like a thief, who, like if someone is a thief and they die during an act of robbery, then that means that you should give what they stole to their fellow thieves and to their families, right? But the notion is that land is what is holy. But if you die for the land, you died in the name of God, in the name of the Holy Land. And on the Hamas side, and also in the Palestinian, in the West Bank side, it also happens there, and Hezbollah, there's the concept of a shaheed, the martyr. Again, the living don't really matter. Like you die for the cause. It is, you are more important in your death than in your life. So what do you do with the kidnapped people? Us, the Israeli decision makers. And by the way, that concept of the shaheed or the martyr also brings us to some of the reasons that Hamas even did this. Most of the Hamas terrorists on October 7th knew that they were going on a one-way trip. They weren't expecting to come back. Like, they were expecting to die. And Hamas knew that Israel will respond. But it was willing to sacrifice both its people and the Gazan people for the sake of one, terror on the Israeli population, two, for the court of public opinion, and three, and probably most important, I touched on it earlier, Hamas opposes peace. Like, some people say that Hamas did this because it wanted to stop the normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia and Israel and other Arab states. That is true. And because it was feeling that it was being forgotten as Israel normalized its relations with Arab states. That is true. But Hamas also wants the war to continue. Hamas' raison d'etre is the war. So it wants a forever war. And it is willing to sacrifice its civilians in order to create an anti-Israeli sentiment, to nurture it more, to nurture an anti-Israeli sentiment, an anti-Jewish sentiment in the Gazan population, so it will have future soldiers. So it will, and to ensure that Israelis will in turn further to the right. It wants there to be war, and that is the big part of why it is a death cult. So that will be all for today. I know I rambled quite a lot more than I intended to. I guess I had a lot to say. If you have anything to say, please say it civilly in the comment section, and be well and do good, or try to these days. Bye bye.